7 million people displaced, swallowed by a war the world has decided it cannot see. 7 million. That number is larger than the entire population of New Zealand, larger than Denmark, larger than every person living inside the city of Los Angeles. And yet, when you open your news app this morning, you will not find them. The Democratic Republic of Congo is burning. Children are dying in displacement camps. Villages are erased before breakfast. And the global media machine has collectively, calmly, looked the other way. There is a word for what this is. Not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected with information. This is something more deliberate, more dangerous, more revealing about the architecture of whose suffering the world has decided to prioritize. Nelson Mandela had a name for it, and if he were alive today, he would not be whispering it. He would be standing at the center of the global stage, and he would be furious with Western governments, with regional leaders, and with all of us. This video exists to answer one question, not what we imagine Mandela might say, what his documented record actually demands. And the answer, when you follow his philosophy to its honest conclusion, will challenge not just the powerful, it will challenge you. Because there is an unforgivable blind spot at the heart of this crisis, and it lives inside the device you're holding right now. First, understand what is actually happening in Eastern Congo, because the media version, when it appears at all, is stripped of its architecture. The M23 rebel group has seized territory across North Kivu province, backed, according to United Nations experts, by Rwanda, a sovereign neighbor, a Western donor darling. The Congolese army has buckled. Regional peacekeeping forces have withdrawn. Civilians caught between competing powers have nowhere left to go. More than 7 million people are internally displaced. The United Nations calls this the largest displacement crisis on Earth. Larger than Ukraine, larger than Sudan, larger than anywhere you have been told to make room in your conscience for. And beneath the soil where these people are suffering, there is something the world cannot function without. Coltan, cobalt, the minerals powering every smartphone, every electric vehicle, every data center running the platforms through which you consume your news. The Congo does not just have a crisis, it has a product the world is addicted to, and that product is being extracted while the people above it are erased. This is the architecture of the blind spot, and Mandela understood its blueprint long before the DRC became a headline no one prints. To know what Mandela would say today, you must first know what he actually said, on the record, about the world's selective conscience. In August 2002, Mandela stood before journalists and said something that made the Western world deeply uncomfortable. He said, the United States was acting as if it alone could decide which international laws applied and which could be set aside when the stakes were high enough. He was not speaking casually. He was speaking as a man who had survived what that selective logic produces when it reaches the African continent. In 1999, as Burundi stood on the edge of catastrophe, Mandela agreed to lead the peace negotiations, not because it was safe or convenient, because he believed leadership required presence, not opinion. He flew into a region that international powers were treating as secondary. He sat across from men with blood on their hands, and he refused to leave without an agreement. In 1998, as president of South Africa, he brokered the Lusaka Ceasefire Agreement, attempting to end the DRC's first major war, while Western governments offered statements and little else. These are not rhetorical gestures. These are the documented coordinates of a man whose philosophy had one consistent north: that African lives carry the same moral weight as any other lives on this earth, and that when the world acts otherwise, it must be named clearly and without apology. So what would Nelson Mandela say about the Congo today? He would begin with the silence, not with outrage, though the outrage would come. He would begin with a quiet, devastating observation about what the silence reveals. He would say that a crisis response is never random. It follows a logic. And the logic of who gets covered, who gets resourced, and who gets mourned tells you everything. Everything about whose humanity the powerful have chosen to protect. He would say that when Ukraine was invaded, the world mobilized in 72 hours. He would not say this to diminish Ukraine's suffering. He would say it to illuminate the contrast that no one in power wants to discuss openly. He would point to billions committed to Ukrainian refugees in weeks, to NATO restructuring its entire strategic posture in months, to continuous news coverage that ran for years. And then he would ask, with the certainty of someone who had spent his life studying power, why not the Congo? Not rhetorically, as a genuine indictment requiring a genuine answer. The answer is not complexity. Every African crisis gets labeled complex. The answer is not geography. Ukraine is not next door to CNN's headquarters either. The answer is that the architecture of global attention was never designed to treat African suffering as a breaking emergency. It was built to treat it as a permanent low-grade condition, something chronic, something expected, something that does not interrupt the news cycle. Mandela had a name for this practice, the powerful telling the powerless that their suffering is being addressed while the cameras remain pointed elsewhere. He would say that 7 million displaced Congolese people are not a statistic. They are a verdict on the world that produced them and then chose not to look. And then, in the manner of a man who never allowed outrage to become its own cage, he would turn from diagnosis to demand. He would ask the African Union's regional leaders why they are negotiating through proxies and communiques, rather than standing in Kinshasa and Kigali, demanding accountability with their names attached. He would ask why leaders who once bore the weight of colonial humiliation are now willing to use the same silence as their former colonizers, because the mineral profits flow in their direction. This is the part of a Mandela verdict that his admirers often quietly erase. He did not spare allies. Moral authority for him was not something you kept by agreeing with powerful friends. Now, if what you are hearing is shifting the way you see this crisis, this is the moment to subscribe to this channel. Because what comes next is the part of this story almost no one is talking about. A confrontation from 20 years ago containing the precise key to understanding the Congo today. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Stay with this, because the second half is where Mandela's philosophy stops being historical and starts being a mirror held directly at the present. January 2003. The world is weeks away from the invasion of Iraq, and Nelson Mandela is angrier than the global public has ever seen him. Not privately angry, not diplomatically concerned, publicly, explicitly, historically furious. And the target of his fury is not an African warlord. It is the two most powerful leaders in the Western world. He stands before reporters and says, without softening a syllable, "What I am condemning is that one power, with a president who has no foresight, is wanting to plunge the world into a Holocaust." He named George W. Bush. He named Tony Blair. He named the specific moral failure of powerful nations deciding which international laws apply and which can be discarded when the stakes are high enough. Most people remember this as a political disagreement about Iraq. They have forgotten what Mandela was actually constructing in that moment. He was not making a point. He was issuing a prophecy. He understood with devastating clarity that the Iraq War would consume the world's moral attention for a decade. And while it did, other crises, African crises specifically, would calcify into forgotten emergencies. He saw the mechanism. When the powerful choose their emergency, they crowd out everyone else's. Selective urgency does not merely ignore other crises, it actively buries them. He was right. The First Congo War barely registered in Western consciousness. The second, the deadliest conflict since World War II, with over 5 million dead, received a fraction of coverage given to conflicts where Western strategic interests were visible on a map. And today, as M23 advances and displacement camps overflow, and coltan ships to factories that build the devices through which you are watching this video, the pattern Mandela named in 2003 has not changed. It has accelerated. Here is the uncomfortable implication, the one neither side of the current debate wants to sit with. The liberal world that mourns injustice selectively has not failed the Congo through malice. It has failed the Congo through architecture, through systems of attention and moral urgency, never designed to treat African lives as equally interruptible to everything else on the schedule. And the conservative world that argues Western nations have no obligation to intervene everywhere cannot claim moral authority to intervene selectively, only in places that yield strategic returns. Mandela would say, you cannot have moral authority on a sliding scale. The moment you decide some lives trigger your conscience and others do not, you no longer possess moral authority. You possess moral preference, and moral preference is just power with better public relations. He would also say something that his most devoted admirers would find deeply difficult to hear. The African Union's response to the DRC crisis has been an abdication dressed as diplomacy. Communiques are not courage. Avoiding direct confrontation with Rwanda is a betrayal of the solidarity the liberation movement was built upon. Mandela had walked into rooms where no one wanted him there. He had demanded that powerful men answer for what they were doing to powerless people. Not because he was a saint, because he understood that leadership without that willingness is simply administration. And here is where his philosophy arrives at its most precise and most painful point. The test of moral authority is not what you say about your enemies. Anyone can condemn enemies. The test is whether you say the same thing about your allies. The people whose goodwill you depend on. The friends whose support built your platform. The nations whose aid funds your government. Mandela's record on this is unambiguous. He called out the United States. He called out Britain. He called out members of the ANC. He called out African leaders who used liberation language while presiding over new forms of oppression. He would do the same today to Rwanda, whose government he once admired, and whose proxy war in eastern Congo he would name by name, without hesitation, without apology. Because moral authority that stops at friendship is not moral authority. It is loyalty. And loyalty is not a framework for justice. Here is the verdict. The single sentence Mandela's documented philosophy demands as its conclusion about the DRC crisis. The world is not failing the Congo because it lacks the tools to help. It is failing the Congo because it has decided, without saying so, that Congolese lives do not constitute an emergency. That decision is not a foreign policy position. It is a moral confession. It tells you exactly what the powerful believe about who is human enough to save. What do you do with that verdict? Not governments, not the African Union. You. What do? You start by refusing the blind spot inside your own consumption. The phone in your hand contains minerals from a region at war. That is not guilt. That is information. And information, Mandela understood, is the first tool of power. You name the architecture. When someone tells you the DRC is too complex to understand, you recognize that complexity is the oldest tool of inaction. Every crisis the powerful chose to solve was complex. Complexity was never the real obstacle. You demand coverage, not because media is the only tool, but because attention is the oxygen that moral pressure needs to survive. The Congo has existed in an attention desert for 3 decades. That desert was constructed. It can be dismantled. And you remember that Mandela spent 27 years in a cell, utterly without power, and still managed to reshape the moral imagination of the entire planet. Not because he waited for the world to be ready, because he refused to accept that its unreadiness was permanent. The DRC crisis is not unsolvable, it is unprioritized. And unprioritized is a choice, not a fact. If this conversation has shifted something in the way you see this crisis, if you're leaving with a framework for reading global media bias that you did not have when you arrived, hear this. That framework needs to be sharpened regularly with new evidence and new analysis and the historical depth that makes the present legible. That is what this channel exists to do. Not to tell you what to think, to give you tools that make thinking clearer and the courage to act on what you see. Subscribe, not as a passive gesture, as a declaration that you are choosing to see the blind spot, even when the world makes it profoundly comfortable not to. Because that choice, Mandela understood, is where every act of genuine moral courage begins. Not in a grand moment, in a quiet decision to keep looking, even when looking is inconvenient. The Congo is not a tragedy that happened. It is a tragedy that is happening. Right now, in this moment. While this video plays, 7 million people are not waiting for the world to be ready. They're simply waiting. And somewhere in that waiting, the man who spent 27 years doing the same is asking the only question that has ever mattered. When the history of this moment is written, which side of the blind spot will you have chosen to stand on? Walk well. Walk with honesty about what you consume and what that consumption costs. Walk with the courage to name what the powerful have decided not to see. Walk, as Mandela always asked, with your eyes open and your conscience intact.